Expert Jonathan Spyre about the circumstances behind the rise of ISIS and the incredible human cost of the Syrian civil war. Jonathan, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Good to be here, Chris.
You wrote an article not too long about at the anniversary, the 5-year anniversary of the Syrian civil war. What did you want to communicate in that article?
Well, just mainly the extent of the human loss, to be honest, Chris. I mean, I write a lot, of political analysis about the various political and military aspects of the war. But I've also, reported on the ground in various parts of Syria and witnessed a lot of the human suffering that's going on. Human beings inside Syria, on all sides, have suffered in the course of this war. Nearly 10 million people made homeless, almost half the population, maybe 400,000 people dead. The sheer magnitude of what's happening in Syria, it's something that I think needs to get across, especially because to some extent, there's been a kind of waning of global media attention on the Syrian war in the course of the last, I would say, year or so, because other things are going on. And, we still need to be aware of just how many people are suffering and just what needs to be done then. And of course, the other thing I wanted to convey in that article, and I think it's important to remember, is that this war, is nowhere close to finishing. We had, of course, the ceasefire coming in this year on February 27th. It held for a while, but it's now, conclusively broken down, and fighting's taking place across the country once again.
Why should people in the West and Europe care about what's going on in Syria?
Well, to some degree, especially with Europeans, need to care because, of course, Syrian refugees are trying to make their way across into Europe, and that's causing enormous strain on European societies who are not necessarily well prepared to receive those newcomers or who don't wish to receive those newcomers. So from that point of view, I think the Europeans definitely need to care. With regard to the United States, well, there's been a sense in which the US has chosen to kind of absent itself from close engagement in the Middle East, I think, in recent years. There's been a certain weariness, maybe understandable, on the part of the American public in terms of that engagement after the unsuccessful wars, I would say, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Syria, I think, is kind of an example of what happens when America is not involved to keep that security architecture in the region, to deter enemies, to make sure the bad guys stay out. Then what you get is things like the Syrian civil war. So in that respect, I think that has to be of interest to the United States too.
Has this been responsible for the rise of ISIS?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, if we remember that ISIS, of course, comes out of Iraq, and ISIS comes out of the Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq, and that was a body that was effectively defeated, largely by the United States and its Sunni tribal allies in Western Iraq in the course of the latter part of the last decade. And what the Syrian war did is it gave ISIS the chance for a new lease of life. The scattered remnants of the Islamic State in Iraq group came into Syria, into the vacuum that had opened up in Syria in the course of 2012, 2013, began to reorganize themselves, captured territory on the ground, drove other rebels out, and then, of course, in the dramatic events of the summer of 2014, re-invaded back into Iraq and established now this entity, which is now tottering a little bit, but this entity calling itself the Islamic State or the Caliphate. So yes, absolutely, without the vacuum that opened up as a result of the Syrian civil war, it's very hard to imagine how that Islamic State in Iraq, that became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, could have got itself back on its feet.
And how would you characterize the strength of ISIS right now?
ISIS is weakening, I think. ISIS, we're seeing, is losing its territorial holdings inside Iraq and inside Syria. Obviously, they've lost Ramadi. The latest to go is now the town of Fallujah in the last 24 hours. In Syria, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces with US air power backing them up are heading for the town of Menbij, close to the border. So everywhere we look, ISIS territorial holdings are being reduced by a variety of enemies, usually with the backing of Western air power and Western special forces on the ground, and that's good news. The bad news, so to speak, is that as ISIS contracts physically in terms of its territorial holdings on the ground, what we're likely to see, I think, unfortunately, is an increasing use of international terrorism by ISIS. ISIS going from a territorial power on the ground back to what it was before, namely a kind of transnational terror organization. And I think if we look at the increasing number, the increasing list of international terrorist actions taken by ISIS in the course of the last year, France, in Brussels, and so on and so forth, then I think we're already, that's the pattern of events to come, I think.
Well, Jonathan, thanks for your expertise and analysis. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Chris. Always good to talk.